everybody. Today we are debating whether or not there are good reasons to believe in a God, and we're starting right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here for another epic debate as we are tonight debating whether or not there are good reasons to believe in a God. We have, first time here, our new friend, Stephen Dunn. So glad to have you here, Stephen. And if this is your first time here, want to remind you, consider hitting that subscribe button as we've got a lot more debates coming up that we are very excited about. So, also want to let you know, we have our dear friend, TJump. He is back. Look at him, better than ever, in his clamshell chair, just munching away there. He's got his little goldfish. Very nice to see you, Tom. So, want to let everybody know, their links are in the description. So if you're listening, you're like, can't get enough of that TJump. Well, I've got good news. Both of these guys have their links in the description, and as you can see, we've got Tom's link in the border. I mean, he's all over the place. So we are very excited. During the Q&A, if you want to shoot your questions into the live chat, I will pull those questions out. Then, if you've got a super chat, hey, feel free to do a super chat. It puts it to the top of the list, and you can make a comment toward one of the debaters. Now, they'll get a chance to respond to that comment, but if you've always been wanting to maybe poke fun at, TJump or his appearance, it could be a lot of things. Feel free. That's what the super chats are for. So excited, folks, to have you here. Last, just want to let you know, we're going to do about roughly 8 to 10 minute optional, flexible opening statements. And then following that, we'll have open discussion where the speakers will just converge on their kind of points and kind of hash it out. And then we'll have Q&A. It's about 25 minutes of Q&A, so about an hour and a half total. And thanks, gentlemen, for being here. I guess since we usually have the affirmative go first, Stephen, if you're up for going first, we're more than happy to have you get the ball rolling.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. I guess now's a good time to start.
You bet.
Perfect. So I guess just to kind of talk about some preliminary sort of things before I get into the argument that I'm going to share with Tom. Because, of course, as some of you probably don't know or do know, me and Tom debated actually about a year ago. I think it was about a year this month or a year last month. So it's kind of interesting that we're coming back together on this topic. But I wanted to cover a number of different areas, similarly from that conversation, but a little bit different now. Because I've read a little bit more about Tom. I've looked into his book, into this epistemological model that he talks about if you really dive into Tom as a thinker. And I think that if we're going to have significant conversations with Tom as to whether or not God exists, or if there's good reasons to believe that God exists, or if it's possible to even obtain a knowledge of God, that we have to kind of work with Tom on his sort of, on his battlefield, so to speak. So, of course, we'll be talking about some matters in religious epistemology and some preliminary things in natural theology. So a lot of these things may have some heady kind of subjects. So I'm just going to kind of go through them as I can see fit, eruditely as possible. But of course, I always like to emphasize an important existential matter as to the question before us. Raymond Tallis, who's an atheist philosopher, I always like to bring up his quote. He said that as an atheist, I acknowledge that the idea of God is the greatest, the biggest, and most terrible idea that humans have ever had. And so as I approach this debate, you'll notice that I'm taking a procedure that sheds light on a number of areas that religious epistemologists, theologians, and even atheists tend to miss or not appreciate. And it's this emphasis for a kind of existential vitality that permeates our thinking about God and the world. So, of course, we're not merely detached thinkers on the subject of God's existence, despite many misunderstandings of, Pascal's argument or his wager. He was right when he said that the matter will eventually, if not ultimately, boil down to how will you wager, or how will you determine an answer to the problem. Now, I'm not so much trying to argue for moral responsibility on ultimate questions. Tom, we need an answer now, or it's nothing like that. But it's just to show that even if religious knowledge is possible, knowledge such that God loves me or that God is an active person, we need to see glimpses of these situations or we need to see them as possible in our prior sort of philosophical engagements about them. So kind of with that said, just to move into my case for the existence of God, and I used this one last year. Everyone popularly knows it as the cosmological argument, or some philosophers would understand it as the argument from contingency. And this argument, if you're not familiar with it, is based on a certain system of viewing the world that makes careful distinctions about how we understand being, existence, knowledge, God, and so forth. And so to get the argument going, I think it's important that I clarify a few terms, because there's a lot of directions and starting points that cosmological arguments can take. But insofar as this argument is supposed to have a communicable element between me and Tom, a Christian and an atheist, or a theist and an atheist, I'm interested in starting points which are more basic or more associable or philosophically agreeable or comfortable for two rational persons to readily recognize once they hear them. So to give a definition of God to start, because the argument rests on initial conceptual considerations regarding God's existence and his relation to the world. And the first point is that we can define God however Tom sees fit. But my definition that I've used is that I understand God as the proper cause of being. So rather than to extend or erect a definition of God such that he's the cause of motion, of change, and so forth, we can define God simply on the agreeable basis that God, if he existed, at least could be understood as the proper cause of being, such that our cosmological argument doesn't need to consider whether or not the universe began to exist at some finite time or what have you. And we don't need to delve over what veracity is contained within some cosmological model. As a matter of fact, we can take a step back and actually make a cosmological assumption that Thomas Aquinas makes in his cosmological argument, and that's that the universe is eternal. I think I had my notes and I got lost here. We can take the assumption that the universe is eternal. And the reason why we're doing this is because that's the more metaphysically difficult route for us to take. Because if we say that the universe actually began to exist at some point in time, I think that inevitably, without question, will lead to the conclusion that, there is a sustaining cause of the world that brought the universe into being from nothing. So let's go a different route and let's just assume that the universe is eternal. But again, we don't have to delve in cosmology, but we just have to say that the universe has a kind of dependability aspect to it. And so this humble kind of assumption that we're making about the universe really tries to get at an existential cosmological question, and that's, why is there something rather than nothing? Now, if the universe, as it exists, is merely possible, then it is capable of being otherwise. So if we are to consider or grant the point that the universe is eternal, then we also must investigate this aspect of possibility. Is the universe and all the states of affairs contained therein, are they necessary to be such as they are, or are they merely possible? And one of the principles that this argument looks to is this idea that if the universe, if it exists, it is merely possible because it has this capability of being otherwise. So however, whatever is capable of being otherwise is not capable of being at all, unless there is some external actualizer to instantiate one possibility over another. So if the present cosmos, being capable of what it is otherwise, can also possibly not be at all, then at this very moment, unless something caused its existence in the sense of preventing it from being reduced to nothingness, nothingness would take place. So at this very moment, then, an ex-nihiliting cause. So we can think of annihilation where something to nothing, but ex-nihilating is something coming from nothing, right? If I'm saying that right. So an ex-nihilative cause is operative, and the act of God then is that required cause, not only in initiating the world to be, but rather in preserving it and sustaining it in its existence. So yeah, I'll just kind of stop my argument there as kind of my case for theism and just see if that's ample grounds for me and Tom to talk. So yeah.
You bet. Thanks so much. And Tom, if you have your own opening statement, thrilled to hear it as well.
Yeah, my position is there are no reasons to believe in a God. All the evidence and arguments presented in defense of a God can be equally or better explained by natural causes without the ad hoc additions of consciousness and other properties associated with a God. Um, that's all I got.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thanks. Open conversation.
Yes, it seems so. So basically, Tom, I anticipated that response because, as you quite know, it's the same one you give every time, no matter what the apologist in question says or does. But it's this idea that there's this kind of equal weight theory as to the arguments for the existence of God. I mean, is that an accurate description of your position? That
Well, I wouldn't say equal weight. I'd say the naturalists' explanations are always better, significantly by about like infinitely much. So I wouldn't say they're equal. I just usually argue that they're equal just to prove the point that there's not
oh,
evidence of a God.
sure, but I mean to say that. So, for example, like whatever argument that we give, no matter what it is for the arguments for the existence of God, even if we made up new ones, you're saying that no matter what they are, there's an equal probability as to there being something like, a naturalistic pantheism or a tritheism, or, as these different possibilities that you're talking about. Am I understanding you correctly here?
No, there's always evidence you could provide that could indicate a God. It just, you haven't provided any. All of the ones I know about fail completely. So it's definitely possible to come up with evidence and arguments that could indicate a God. Just the
So you
ones
would,
used by apologists just don't. They all just fail.
so you would say that knowledge of God is possible.
Sure.
Okay, so now how am I to understand your atheism a little bit better? Because you define atheism as, how would you say that?
There's no reason to believe in a God.
And then you distinguish between a number of different kinds of atheism, right? You talk about methodological, metaphysical, and epistemic. Could you just talk about those a little bit more?
I could, but why are we talking about this?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to press you on this matter of justifying our beliefs and how arguments can kind of point to the existence of God. So, because my criticism really of your view is that you're not really responding to the arguments, or at least the reality or the conclusion that these premises point to. I think if you're actually going to respond to the arguments, you have to look to the metaphysical systems to which they're based and respond therein. I think you're kind of, this is just my honest view, but you're haphazardly kind of surfacing over the arguments and not treating them in their own particular way. Because of course, the arguments for the existence of God they're supposed to emerge a picture, right? But I think that the picture that emerges, to you at least, will always pertain to at least a ground of existence that's necessary, or is some transcendent law, but it lacks personality, or it lacks mind. And that's kind of where I want to have our conversation, because I think this epistemological model that you've crafted centers around a number of details and philosophical misunderstandings about a knowledge of God that I think doesn't allow you further progress into the conversation, at least with others.
Okay, well, my epistemology has nothing to do with the God question at all. I just apply it to the God question. So my epistemology is just, how do we gain knowledge? We start with, I think, therefore I am, and then there's some difference between our imagination and the world we experience around us, and we need some way to differentiate between those two. That's all the epistemology is. So it has nothing to do with God at all. The reason the apologist arguments fail is just because they objectively fail. It's not. I don't address the conclusions because the conclusions don't matter. It's the premises. The premises they're just invalid or unsound in one way or the other. So it doesn't really matter what the conclusion is. All that matters is that the premises fail, and that's kind of what I focus on in the debates I have with apologists, that their arguments just literally fail. It's got nothing to do with my epistemology for the most part. My epistemology is just a means to demonstrate that they fail, because we can use the same arguments to indicate a mutually exclusive conclusion, which means we can prove they fail just by using the law of non-contradiction. And I just use my epistemology to do that, but it really doesn't have anything to do with my epistemology. You don't need my epistemology to show the arguments fail. Lots of philosophers have already done that in many ways.
Yeah, but you would agree that you still need a kind of epistemological framework for you to walk about in these criticism or in these objections to God's existence. Because I'm not saying epistemological model as in like you sat in a room somewhere and wrote some things down, but this is actually a way you view the world and how you understand principles of being and so forth. And I think that this theoretical framework, at least you would agree, impacts or has repercussions for the kinds of beliefs you would obtain in the area of a knowledge of God.
Well, sure, it's epistemology. It's how we gain knowledge of any kind. So it would also pertain to knowledge of a God, which is true of any epistemology. But again, that's really not relevant to the arguments. The arguments just all objectively fail. It has nothing to do with my epistemology. It's not like my epistemology is what makes them fail. My epistemology is just a way to look at them to show they fail in an easy, understandable way. Well,
but of course, I mean, I think it is because you kind of fall guys to the kind of problems of modern philosophy, in that I think it's a new breadth of skepticism that you're kind of erecting. I mean, so I guess to kind of start back, your epistemology isn't conducive to the kinds of evidences that would be available if they such existed for God. So in other words, I'm
I would
saying
disagree with that immediately. So again, my epistemology is just using the law of non-contradiction. Like if I said, Bob is not married, and you said, therefore we can show, or Bob is married. Bob is married. You can say, well, therefore Bob is married to Sue. I'd be like, well, no, that isn't evidence Bob is married to Sue, because he could be married to Jane. And I'd be like, so clearly you can't use that argument to say he's married to Sue. That doesn't work. And then, oh no, yes you can, clearly, because it's, but yeah, for some reason, blah blah blah. And I can prove that false. I can prove that argument fails, because the fact that Bob is married doesn't tell us anything about who he's married to. So you're making this ad hoc leap from Bob is married to Bob is married to Sue, and that's just objectively not supported by the evidence. So my epistemology is totally fine with evidence of a God, if you actually have evidence of a God, and it's open to that. The problem is that nothing presented by theists is actually evidence. It's not like it could be.
So
evidence.
then what?
No, it's literally just not evidence. It's like the Bob is married example. It just literally does not indicate that he's married to Sue. You can't use it to do that just by the laws of logic.
Perfect. So how then do you understand evidence?
Something that increases the probability of one conclusion over its alternatives.
Okay, so just this could be anything that increases the probability of the likelihood or of the veracity of some claim or some proposition
over its alternatives. Yes.
Okay, and these evidences, these support, do they correspond to certain epistemic situations, such that certain kinds of an evidence might differ from other kinds, such as, for example, the evidence required for the proposition nothing is faster than the speed of light, as opposed to evidence for the proposition, that you're sitting in a chair and we're talking about God. You would agree that there's different kinds of evidences for those kinds of claims?
No, those are still just novel testable predictions. For either one of those work fine. I don't see there's different classes of evidence. Like if I told you I saw a unicorn, that wouldn't be justified, because my personal testimony, my conceptual evidence, isn't sufficient to justify that a unicorn actually exists in the world. For that, you would need empirical scientific evidence.
Tom,
so there are different classes of evidence, but not in the case of the speed of light and I'm sitting in a chair. Both of those are just the same basic thing, empirical evidence.
Tom, we can't quite hear you that well. People in the audience are asking if you could turn up your gain.
It's already maxed, James. I've already turned it as far as it goes.
Sorry, folks. He's trying. I remember my first time when I got my Yeti, but that's all right. Okay, so go ahead, gentlemen.
Yeah, but sorry, I forget if you were saying something, Tom.
I would not say that there is different classes of evidence for saying I'm sitting in a chair and there's different speeds of light. They're both just empirical evidence is what supports both of those.
So for example, like you say that there's differences between conceptual claims, conceptual evidence, empirical claims, empirical evidence, metaphysical claims, metaphysical evidence, and etc.
Yes.
Now, and you say that claims, the kind of claim made has to correspond to the kind of evidence, right? So if it's conceptual claim, it has to have conceptual evidence. If it's an empirical claim, it has to have empirical evidence, and so on.
Yes.
But now what I'm wondering is that do these claims, all three of them, do they become reasonable only in this realm of the empirical? Once they become empirically verified, or if they've been instantiated as having...
No.
Okay.
So conceptual claims become reasonable if you have conceptual evidence. Empirical claims become reasonable if you have empirical evidence, and metaphysical claims become reasonable if you have metaphysical evidence. The only ones that require empirical are the empirical claims.
Well, okay, sure. But so how do you erect if something exists metaphysically or something exists conceptually? I mean, not to sound redundant, that of course you give it conceptual evidence or metaphysical evidence, but what would the evidence look like if you were to provide the truth for a conceptual claim, for example?
The fact that you can imagine it is sufficient for a conceptual claim. Conceptual just means anything in your imagination. So if you can imagine a unicorn, then there is a conceptual unicorn. So if I told you I am imagining a unicorn, the conceptual evidence of my testimony is sufficient to make that claim reasonable to believe.
Right. Now, what about, so in this realm of conception, what about the idea of coherence? So for example, yeah, so for something to be verified conceptually, it'd have to be a coherent idea, correct?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, the fact that I can't imagine what you're imagining may or may not be, but I don't know what you're good at.
I mean, it may be apparently incoherent, but you can't have a concept, at least in your head, as existing or possibly existing in reality if it's incoherent, right? So if I provide a definition of something such that there's a contradiction or a misunderstanding in the words I'm using, then you would agree that it's impossible for something to exist in reality because it has that element of incoherence.
Well, no. The conceptual evidence is only saying it can exist in your imagination. So if there's a contradiction in your description, then that thing can't exist in your imagination. Reality is a whole different thing. That has total separate category completely.
Yeah, I mean, sure, but none, even whatever empirical claims there still nonetheless is a kind of conceptual basis to it. You would agree that at least the conceptual and the empirical have to be in agreement with one another, right?
No. I mean, we can prove that false in like 5 seconds. Einstein claimed that time could bend, and philosophers claim that time was a philosophical concept. It's not a physical concept. They were just proven false. So we can have these concepts of what reality consists of, like time, and can imagine it's a philosophical concept, and we just be false. It's actually a physical concept. So no, there could be apparent contradictions, like saying time can bend isn't a contradiction. Like there's logically, in the philosophical sense, time isn't a physical object. It can't physically bend. So to say it could bend would be like saying the square root of a pork chop, or to say that age could bend or something like that. It physically can't bend because it's not a physical object. So there's a contradiction in the way we use those terms. But that contradiction only applies to our conceptual framework. It doesn't apply to reality. Reality doesn't care about our conceptual framework at all.
But do you think that these oddities or these linguistic like kind of conundrums that exist in these matters of science are really reflective of what goes on exactly in our epistemological makeup?
I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, again, epistemological makeup is just the framework we use to gain knowledge. And
yeah, so I'm saying that, okay, so when scientists or philosophers talk about time or a concept in a qualified way, where it seems as if there's an apparent contradiction, I'm saying that in those instances, are you saying that that's reflective of what's going on in our usual like capacity or our usual experience with obtaining knowledge? You see what I'm saying? Is experience really comprised of these oddities or these kind of like not so apparent sort of experiences? You see what I'm saying here?
Again, not really, no. So again, we have a conceptual framework, which is our epistemology, the way we label things, and that's all just in our head, has nothing to do with reality. So if we want to say that our conceptual framework corresponds to reality, well, then that's when we need the empirical evidence. We need to be able to show that whatever we think is the case, like time is a philosophical concept or it doesn't bend or whatever, we have to make testable predictions to show if this hypothesis is correct, we can expect to see these results under these experiments or whatever. And then we can show that whatever our conception is, either it does or does not correspond to the reality outside of us. Our head.
Okay. How do you understand existence then? So like, if I have something that exists in my mind as opposed to something that exists in reality, like what?
It exists in your mind as opposed to exist in like the external reality. That's the difference.
No, I mean,
what is an idea? What is some external thing?
All right, let's suppose I have a concept in my head that I obtained by some testimonial evidence. Let's say it's substantial testimonial evidence. I have no direct experience with the thing. I'm just saying, like, is it possible for something to exist in my understanding? Does it exist in any way in the same sense as something existing outside of reality?
No, that's technically not possible. You can't, like when you try to imagine a chair or something, you can't imagine the particles it's made of. You just imagine an idea, a vague conception in your head of its function and how it relates to your senses. It's not at all the same as the reality of the chair in and of itself.
Okay. So would you say that conceptual objects or metaphysical objects, do they only exist in the mind, or could they exist in reality generally? I'm just trying to understand.
Are a separate category. So conceptual objects, could they exist in reality? Sure. Do they? Probably not. Like, there's probably nothing that we imagine in our conception which is an accurate description of how they exist in reality. They could, though. It's not logically impossible. Metaphysical things are just the fundamental nature of reality. So none of our conceptions are metaphysical things. Those are, again, two different classes, just like none of our conceptions are the empirical things. Those are two different conceptions, two different things.
Okay. So what is a metaphysical thing as well? Like, what is a metaphysical claim or object? How do you understand
the fundamental nature of reality? So I think therefore I am is the only one that I'm willing to grant, or maybe math and logic just for the sake of the argument. But I think therefore I am an absolute truth that can't possibly be false in any possible sense.
Okay, so the idea that you, or that I exist or you exist is a fundamental truth that can't be otherwise.
Yeah, I think therefore I am.
Okay. Do you think that this is a basic belief that you hold about the world?
I don't grant basic beliefs at all. I don't think they're required for anything.
Why is that?
Because I disagree with the conception of basic beliefs, and properly basic isn't a real concept. It's arbitrary. It doesn't actually correspond to anything in reality. I think it's just false.
Well, why do you feel that way? I mean, why don't you think that there are some beliefs which are more basic than others? I mean, I'm not asking you to subscribe or to comment on.
I can grant that some beliefs are more basic than others in the order in which we learn them from birth, but I don't think any beliefs are inherently basic at all. I think that many creatures like C. elegans or whatever form of animal first started with consciousness didn't have any beliefs to begin with at all. They're just taking in sense data, and beliefs were a secondary cause way later in the evolutionary process. I don't think there are any basic beliefs or properly basic anything. I think that's just an arbitrary label that's been placed on certain kinds of beliefs that people want to have special epistemic status that don't.
Yeah, but do you think that introspection and awareness of the self is a construct, or if it's a discovery? I mean, even if you aren't sure of what other basic beliefs there are out there, whether or not there are basic beliefs, it just sounds like you would at least admit to the fundamental kind of principle that I exist, at least, right?
Right. So I think therefore I am is a discovery. Your brain experiences something, and then you can process that in such a way which it gives you self-awareness.
Okay.
But it's not properly basic. I mean, again, many things don't have that. They don't have self-awareness because their brains just don't have the function to produce it. So it's just properly basic because it can't be false in that sense, but it's not properly basic in the fact that it's somehow inherent to brains or something.
So why do you think, what do you think accounts for this kind of basic beliefs kind of thing? Or that
I reject all basic beliefs.
Oh, okay.
It's ridiculous.
So forgive me. So just going back to that point about at least just self-knowledge, what accounts for that self-referentiality about that belief?
Our brains, the experience. What do you mean?
Why is it true? Why do we have any reason to think it's true? Why is it established as the discoverable fact that you come to know?
Because I'm thinking, and if I didn't exist, I wouldn't be thinking. So the fact that I'm thinking makes it true necessarily.
Well, see, this is where I think the problem, it gets frustrating, because it just seems like at the end of a number of ropes, I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this with other apologists, is that we reach this kind of tautology, right? I think that you're open, I mean, I really do, in a strange sense, to a kind of minimal theism, where we can talk about the necessary ground of existence and kind of the implications thereof, because I think you're open to it, but I think you're stuck with a kind of empirical tautology, or an empiricist tautology, where things just kind of become reductionistic kind of within themselves. I don't think there's any kind of heuristic or existential progress, vitality in those kinds of perspectives. I mean, so if we're talking about the nature of introspection and self-knowledge and kind of these basic principles of existence, we need to kind of work through the basic principles of being and knowledge and existence and kind of see what's on the same plane as this kind of self-knowledge, or where else can we work out to? Now, of course, this was the problem of Descartes, where all the knowledge that we have kind of passes through this self-knowledge. And in a way, my argument kind of tells you to rip that off and to totally think in another way. And this is what's going to be kind of frustrating, is because we're having this worldview sort of difference.
Well, I mean, if your worldview works and you can actually demonstrate it works as evidence, that's totally fine. I'm happy to accept it. Like, I'm just going to show that if it can't, I'm going to show why it can't, and then just dismiss it as being false.
No, of course, but I think it's because, I mean, it's because it's an extension of your epistemological framework. This goes back
again,
to
so my epistemology is irrelevant here. So if I can show your argument is false and like violates the law of non-contradiction, like my example of Bob is married, therefore Bob is married to Sue, well, then your argument is just objectively false. My epistemology is irrelevant because we can just demonstrate your argument is false.
But if your worldview kind of excludes...
No. So again, this is just the law of non-contradiction. My worldview is irrelevant. Okay. I don't care about my worldview. I just present your argument. I'll show why it's false, irrelevant to my worldview.
But I see, but you're not kind of appreciating the point is, I'm not saying that you're speaking from you're not speaking from, I don't know, you're not speaking from somewhere, so to speak. Okay. It's kind of like this.
I have no idea what that means. Not speaking from somewhere.
I need to better qualify this. So you're speaking from a framework which allows you to interpret the reason and the evidence that's offered, right?
The law of non-contradiction. So I just start with the laws of logic, and as long as you grant those, I can show why your argument is false.
But see, I think conversely that the laws of logic, if we follow them properly with certain considerations of the philosophy of being, then we can work to a knowledge of God's existence. But I'm curious.
If you could, that would be evidence. I'm just going to show you can't. That's the point.
But I think that you don't think that I can anyway.
I mean, of course I don't think you can, because no one can do it, but that's irrelevant. If you could actually do it, go for it. I mean,
that's what I'm talking about. You don't have that epistemological optimism.
No. Again, so that's irrelevant. So whether or not I believe you can or believe you can't is irrelevant to whether or not your argument actually does. So like, I don't believe you can because inductively I've seen all apologist arguments. They're all terrible junk arguments. They're just obviously false. But you could present one that may work. That's totally possible. I can't disprove that.
Right.
I mean, so if you just actually presented one that worked, that would be great. But if I can show it doesn't work, well, then I'm not going to accept it. So.
Well, but this is why I think apologists challenge you on shifting you to a kind of agnosticism, because of course there may be arguments or evidences or reasons that you don't know of.
Sure. Have demonstrate it. Like, I mean, so I take the strong position that there are none. And if you can prove me false, then I'm happy to jump to agnosticism. But until then, I'm going to stick with atheism.
I got you. Okay. Well, let's just kind of go back to the kind of my argument, because I want to kind of stick with just one. I think with our last debate, I don't know if you noticed this problem, but we wanted to go through a lot of different things. It's kind of important that I chose, are there reasons to believe in a God? Because it keeps us within this philosophical realm where we don't have to go so much to informed, revealed religious content as to the matter of Jesus' resurrection, miracles, and all that, because that's.
I'm happy to go with whatever you want to go with. So in my
conversations,
of course.
I'm just saying that. Is there at least some fundamental considerations of being that we could at least agree on and work together towards a knowledge of God? So that's why I'm saying let's look back to my argument. What exactly in that presentation did you have a problem with, or could you have found philosophical problems with?
The notes I wrote down were Pascal's wager. I mean, Pascal's wager fails because there's no probabilistic difference between belief in a God and non-belief in a God. Either are equally likely to get you the infinite reward. The contingency argument, you said God was the proper cause of being. Well, I mean, I don't know exactly what a proper cause of being, what that means exactly, because being is just existence. So if God exists, well, he's already in being, so he can't be the proper cause of being. There can't be a proper cause of being because whatever caused it must exist and be a being. So I don't really understand what you mean by that.
Yeah. Okay.
God could possibly be different. And by your definition, you said anything that could possibly be different couldn't be the fundamental thing, because there has to be something more fundamental to cause one of its possibilities over the other. Therefore, I would eliminate your idea of a God immediately just by your own definition. Those would be like the main things, I guess.
Okay. So all three of those are a misunderstanding of the argument. And just working through them. So the first one, the proper cause of being, to better explain that. So in other words, there's a lot of questions that we could ask, like, why do good things happen to bad people? God may be the answer, but not really. Why is there suffering in the world? Why does 2 and 2 equal 4? God may be the answer, but God doesn't become a necessity in those kinds of questions. What question could we ask to which God is the only answer, to which God is what I would call, or Aquinas would call, the proper cause of being? or the exclusive cause of being, if you prefer a different phrase. So the only question is, why is there something rather than nothing? That is the only existential, cosmological, philosophical question that approximates God in a relevant way, at least insofar as this argument is concerned. And I couple this argument with that question because what we notice about the universe is that it has this element of possibly being otherwise. You know, particles didn't have to have, certain particles didn't have to have the certain weight that they do. And all kinds of events didn't have to occur in such and such ways, such that the universe doesn't have this inherent quality of.
Let me interrupt there for a second. So
Yeah.
the fact that we can imagine it being otherwise does not mean it could have been otherwise. So we don't actually know whether the universe could have been otherwise or not. We just assume it could because we can imagine it could have been otherwise. So, but the same thing applies to God. God could have been otherwise. We can define God in many different ways and have many different properties. Moving consciousness as one example, personality as another example. Those things can just be dismissed, and so God could be otherwise. Or we could imagine a God who wanted suffering instead of happiness, or immoral instead of morality. So God, there are even more variations of the way God could be than there are variations of the way the universe could be.
Of course, but you've shifted the problem back to creation, or back to being, or having the explanation of the universe kind of be self-referential back to itself.
What?
So when you said that necessity could just be contained within the universe, like necessity doesn't need to point beyond kind of what exists or what created the universe. Necessity could just kind of be here. Or in other words, that you say this distinction of possibility and necessity is just this conceptual distinction that I've made up in my own mind. Well, what I'm saying is that in our experience of reality, things didn't have to be the way they are, such as they've been. For example, the state of affairs of existence, any one that's taken place, is not a necessary act.
Well, again, so that's an assumption. We can imagine them being differently, but that doesn't mean they can actually be differently. So saying that our ability to imagine them being otherwise does not follow that they could have actually been otherwise. Those are two separate claims.
No, wait, so sorry, you got cut off a little bit. So say that again, that last part.
The fact that we can imagine something being otherwise, it does not therefore follow that it could have been otherwise. The universe, everything in the universe could be completely determined, and it could never have been otherwise, and it was exactly the only way it could have been. And the fact that we imagine it being otherwise isn't evidence that it could have been otherwise.
Right. Okay. So of course we don't have to get hung up on that principle too much. I just I think it's an important exercise in our thinking of conception. But at least insofar as, as I understand this kind of argument in the atheists that criticize certain aspects of the argument, I haven't heard the criticism that the possibility and necessity might be a meaningless distinction. I think you're ignoring the broader terms of denying that distinction or the reality of that distinction, because what that means is that the universe has kind of this explanatory power within itself, or it's contained within itself somehow, at least.
Well, no, this is actually a pretty common thing in physics. Like, I've had many physicists on, and we talk about this as one of the possibilities many, many times, that, yeah, this is the way the universe is, and that it's the necessary thing instead of a God. That's clearly one of the possibilities, one of the most obvious possibilities. Physicists don't usually bring it up because they don't talk about the necessary thing, because science doesn't give us access to that metaphysical level of knowledge. They're just all made up. So we can make up any necessary thing and say, well, this is the necessary thing and be done. It's just an ad hoc argument. And so that's why physicists don't do it. They could, they just don't.
I got you. What was the second point that you had mentioned about, do you have the points that you mentioned earlier? Because you mentioned 3.
Well, the first one I mentioned was the Pascal's wager thing. So I think what you're talking about is when I said God could be otherwise, there are lots of other ways God could be.
Oh, well, I would of course disagree with that, just insofar as how I understand necessity within God's nature.
Right, and I can just arbitrarily define the universe as necessary in the way it is nature, in exactly the way you do, and so both claims are equally as plausible there.
Well, and that's why I was pressing you and saying that it's absurd to do that, because you're grounding you're grounding necessity in the process of the world order. You can't do that, because it doesn't really explain what's going on. You only have a succession of events, and okay, let me rephrase this. You only have a succession of events that are explained back within those events, right? Such that the explanatory power of this system, the universe, is just contained within itself as a whole. That's a problem, because the universe, like I said, I think it has this aspect of being otherwise.
Well, I mean, I can
Because
just
the
grant that
universe,
and say the necessary thing is outside of the universe, and we can just make up other necessary things. I mean, again, the point here is just to say that anybody can make up a necessary thing. No form of evidence we have actually gets us to a necessary thing. It's just a made-up assertion in our heads. That's why physicists don't actually assert necessary things or necessary particles or necessary laws or the multiverse being necessary. There could always be another thing before that, because no form of evidence in our reality actually gets us to a stopping point of a necessary end of all possible truths. It's just a made-up assertion, and anybody can make up such assertions. They don't need to be a god or the universe or the laws of physics. We can just make up any of them we want and just call it a necessary thing.
okay. So maybe on that view, let's try maybe something different. Maybe instead of just saying God, we can do like a kind of general description. Maybe we can make up something new just for language sake. Like, let's just call it D. This uncaused cause, which determines between contingent realities. Could you agree in the possibility of something like that existing?
Sure,
So
I can grant that there is a necessary thing by that definition.
right. So it would be an uncaused cause, which determines differences or determines between contingent realities. So in other words, so it's kind of saying that in the action of D being D, so to speak, and how we would know it is because that there are contingent realities, and we know contingency by this nature because it has this element of possibility to it.
Well, no, that's completely ad hoc. So possibility and contingency are, again, just things in our head. There's nothing more than just we can imagine things being differently. There is no correspondence to reality whatsoever in those things at all. So, like, again, everything in the world that we see around us may not have been otherwise. Maybe this is just the only possible way anything ever could have been, and there couldn't be any otherwise or alternatives. We just imagine them being otherwise. So the fact that we can imagine them being otherwise doesn't tell us anything about the fundamental nature of reality. So this possibility and contingency thing you're talking about has nothing to do with what the necessary thing is at all.
It seems like you're going ad hoc in the other direction, whereas you think I'm going ad hoc in kind of my direction. I think you're going unnecessarily explaining by just saying that things have this kind of built-in necessity. When
no, I'm saying it's a possibility. So you're being ad hoc because you're asserting this is the way it is. I'm just saying, well, no, that's not necessarily the way it is. There's other possibilities here. I'm not saying these are the way it is. I don't know what the way is. I don't know what the fundamental nature of reality is or not. But I do know that one of the possibilities is completely contrary to what you're saying. And so what you're saying is just making an assumption about the fundamental nature of reality, which is baseless.
No, I'm just making a distinction in something that's readily available to your experience, or at least your concept of experience. I mean, I'm trying to create
so
something.
again, my argument is the fact that we can imagine things being otherwise isn't evidence they could have actually been otherwise. Like, I could imagine that the car outside could be purple.
You're right, actually. I didn't say it was evidence.
Okay. I thought you said that our experience of possibilities and contingency tells us something about the necessary
included
thing
within our experience of contingent things. That's how I would say it. I wouldn't say it's evidence per se of, but.
So you're saying it tells us something about the necessary thing? Yes,
because of our experience of it. Now, our experience, of course,
that's evidence.
I don't want to use evidence in that qualified kind of way, because I think you're trying to find support for a view, so to speak. And I'm trying to describe a view you already have. Is kind of my point.
Well, I don't have that view, because again, I think that everything we see around us could just be necessary and determined with no possible differences at all. That's one possibility. I don't have a view one way or the other on that topic.
Okay. And then just for sake of conversation, so you had related that to Pascal's wager and then said it didn't make sense with God. And then maybe there's a third point I was missing. That's what I'm trying to get to. Sorry.
Well, yeah, Pascal's wager was just the first thing he said. It wasn't relevant to the contingency argument.
Well, I just mentioned Pascal because, on the question of whether or not God exists, I really do take that 50-50 position where you and I both could be wrong, but the matter is like, if there is a God so defined, it either exists or it doesn't. So Pascal's wager, whatever it's saying, which it doesn't matter, of course, for this debate, but it's just saying that how will you wager? He says in the Pensées that, in the distance, or in the infinite distance, there's a coin being tossed and it's either going to land heads or tails. How will you wager? That's kind of what I'm saying.
Right. But Pascal's wager objectively fails. Like, all philosophers just like, yeah, we know this is false objectively, because if there is a God, well, maybe the God gives a person who believes infinite reward, or maybe the God gives the person who doesn't believe infinite reward. And both of those possibilities are equally likely. And so belief in a God and rejection of a God are both equally likely to get you the infinite reward.
But see,
so that argument just objectively fails. Like, it doesn't get you anywhere.
But I think,
believe or not believe.
Can I ask you, this is just, because of course you could ask me the same question about a lot of things. I don't mean to ask you to be insulting, but like, have you ever, have you read the Pensées? Have you read the argument in the
long time ago?
Well, so I don't think that, if you read the Pensées and you read the argument of the wager, you're not getting you're not so much getting a probabilistic kind of argument. It's not a mathematization of how we can think about God. I don't agree with the claim that philosophers pretty much think it objectively fails. I think that Pascal's wager could be qualified to be a kind of mathematized argument, but it's not intended to be like that.
Right. The point of the argument is to give the reason Pascal gives it is to try and give a reason to believe in a God a priori without any considerations of evidence. He's just saying, well, should we have a reason to believe in a God as to not believe in a God? And he's offering this heaven and hell alternative as why we should believe there is a God as opposed to not believe in a God. And the reason the argument objectively fails is because the reward he's offering up as the reason applies both to the case of believing and the case of not believing. So it's been philosophically disproven. Like, if we just look at the polls or whatever in the philosophical community, like, this is not a compelling argument. Like, pretty much everyone accepts this doesn't work at all.
Yeah, but that's on the presupposition that he's trying to make an argument to establish the reality of God's existence. That's not exactly.
He literally says that. That's the first line of the thing. The reason he's presenting this argument is to provide a reason to believe before considerations of the evidence. That's the purpose.
Well, of course, but he talks about reasons of the mind and reasons of the heart. And so what he's trying to do is to kind of unite the two, right? Really, his goal for the Pensées is to try and create an experience of the human heart to come to know the reality of God. So there's an existential aspect associated with the argument that I don't think is appreciated. And that's all.
Because he literally says this argument is specifically just for the point of trying to present a reason to believe without any prior evidence. So the follow-up arguments that he provides of the reasons of the heart have nothing to do with this argument. This argument is purely just a logical presentation to try and give you a reason to believe.
But he's not offering reasons prior to the evidence. He's saying that if you can't make up your mind despite the evidence, if you don't know where to stand, then here's a possible way to think about your reason and your desires, such that here's a way that God could seem attractive to you. That's how I understand the Pensées is essentially saying.
Yeah, so the point is to say, here's a reason without the evidence, without consideration of the evidence. It's independent of the evidence. That's kind of the point.
Yes, but I think you're trying to relate his argument more on matters of justification, whether or not his argument has like a premise to conclusion kind of setup that could be more or less, successful or not successful. And of course, it's an argument at the end of the day. And I'm not even defending Pascal's wager, but I'm just trying to defend more this kind of existential aspect of his argument, where it's maybe.
I'm not sure what you're saying here. So again, the point of Pascal's wager was he wanted to give people a reason to believe in a God without consideration, independent of the evidence. Whether or not you've considered the evidence or not, doesn't matter. This argument is a standalone argument that is meant to give you a reason to believe in a God. And my objection is that, well, it doesn't. It's like saying Bob is married, therefore Bob is married to Sue. That doesn't follow, because the second is an assumption that you are unsupported, because Bob is married to Jane is equally as plausible as Bob is married to Sue. So saying Bob is married to Sue is just factually false. The argument does not indicate that conclusion. Pascal's wager is the same. It fails because of the law of non-contradiction. Non-belief, or choosing not to believe, is equally as likely to get you the infinite reward that Pascal is talking about as belief. Therefore, the argument he presents objectively does not give you a reason to believe. So his argument just objectively fails. What he's trying to do in that argument just objectively fails.
Yeah, I don't. I'm just gonna kind of finish that one saying I don't agree, but I think that's a number of things on interpretation and then understanding as well. But how I approach the Pensées is just kind of the historical context for which Pascal wrote it, because of course Pascal is in the height of kind of that Cartesian skepticism, because mind you, he is post-Descartes. There's kind of this now superseding rationalism that exists in theology, where a kind of theological skepticism emerges. And what he's doing is that he's erecting, like I said, this new experience or knowledge of God that's more about the relation to the human heart, or the relation with the human heart to the reality of God. And that's the only thing that I think that the argument is trying to capture. Now, as like I said, as far as that mathematical probability element to it, a lot of philosophers like to point out that really this argument is just an extension in his work on computational analysis, or at least calculus and so forth. That really is just a kind of mathematical extension of what he already was working on in science and mathematics and so forth. I think it belittles and waters down the existential vitality of the argument, because we need more arguments that don't just give us more information about God, but we need arguments that put us better on our feet, such that if we do come to a knowledge of God, then we can kind of walk about in the world. Because of course, my cosmological argument, once it's said and done, we still have to settle matters of, not just the unity and the intelligibility of the universe and stuff like that, but also, suffering and personally relating in the world. So it's a very unified picture, this idea of theism. And anyway, so Pascal, I think, just does a kind of other side of the coin. That's how I interpret his natural theology anyway. That's all I meant there with respect to my argument. It's not so much an added point for support, I guess. Anyway, I'm just kind of blowing hot air now. But no, but the third thing you said, you had criticized the proper cause of being and how that related to my understanding of God, which I take as two, but you said a third one.
Yeah, I said I didn't understand what the proper cause of being was. God could possibly be different, and by your definition, anything that could possibly be different must have been created by something else to instantiate that one possibility as opposed to the alternatives.
Okay. Yeah, I think my notes. Do you have any particular questions about anything? Anything that on your mind, do you want to continue or to press or to ask or?
Well, from my position, all you're doing is making up labels, and there's no evidence of any of those labels. If you want to claim that these are actually properties in the universe, well, then I have to hold you to the same standard of physicist. Physicist makes up a new particle, like a WIMP, weak interacting massive particle. Well, then I don't care if they want to define it that way, or if they want to look at a certain combination of things in the world and give it a label as a WIMP. It doesn't make a difference if it's just imaginary until you demonstrate otherwise, until you can actually make a testable prediction that verifies that these labels you've made up actually correspond to something. Well, it's just a made up label in your head. It's imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. And the approach you take seems to be very much like the Thomistic approach. And these labels that he applies are, again, just made up imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. And I don't see any reason to take the labels seriously any more than I take the label of phlogiston seriously. It's just, you look at a phenomenon, you give it a label and say, well, this is what it is. And you try to make arguments about where those labels lead or the consequences they get to, but they're baseless. They're just, again, demonstrate it's not imaginary. Until you can do that, it's imaginary until demonstrated otherwise.
Right. So even these distinctions that I've made, even the ones that Thomists make, I haven't even talked about them, but of course they're inherent within the argument. But distinction between possibility and necessity, or actuality and potentiality, these are just kind of constructions, just imaginary distinctions that were made up. There's no possible.
Right. It's like Theseus's ship, or the argument of the heap, or the problem of identity is just saying, we're going to take this observation and we're going to give it a label. And then we're going to say, well, this label applies to everything, and therefore we can make inferences. Like, for example, the potentiality and actuality argument, we can just show that's false, because if we just accept the B theory of time, well, everything is just the way it is, and there is no change. Change doesn't exist. There is no change to be had. It's just appearance of change, or a delusion of change that doesn't actually exist. So if there is no change, well, then there is no potentiality and actuality. Everything just is. And so that was one possible ontology that just shows that this idea of potentiality and actuality just takes the things we experience, gives them a label, and then assumes that that label then applies to the fundamental nature of what exists, the ontology of reality, baselessly. Just like saying phlogiston, well, we can see this phenomenon of things rising when we heat them, therefore it's phlogiston. Well, That's not evidence. You have to show this isn't an imaginary property first. Otherwise, it's just imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. And that's kind of the problem with the Thomistic properties like potentiality and actuality. They're just made up labels, and they don't tell us anything about ontology. They're just assumed to tell us about ontology.
Okay. So I guess just to pose one question. So how Thomists kind of paint the picture of, where we are rational creatures, we're endowed with, attributes of intelligibility, but we can, as subjects, we can relate with the objects known, for example, such that like we're not just learning some fact about something, but we're very much coming into an encounter or experience with that thing. So Russell, for example, talked about knowledge by description, where, we see the man with the hat who sits next to us on the train. We see him getting, chicken nuggets for lunch every day at 6, and so on and so forth. And there's a number of descriptions that take place. But then one day he comes up to us and says, look, my name is Stephen Dunn. And so what happens here is not a collection of experiences or facts, but now we have this element of encounter where there's a kind of disclosure taking place among persons. So Thomists have this entire system of viewing the world, of having this aspect of personality, of relatability, intelligibility, and so on. And it kind of undergirds the framework for how they come to a possible knowledge of God's existence. In other words, that's the kind of an ontology or epistemology that kind of brings optimism for helping us allow to think how God can exist or how God can relate to the world, right? So that's what I mean when I say our epistemological framework is related to how we kind of approach these matters, because theists, or at least Thomists, have this informed perspective that kind of is conducive to that. My question after that rant was, what is your substitute for them? In your account of, knowing reality, or at least knowing ultimate reality, what is kind of this basis? What is the ontology to which you describe?
Well, right. So I totally agree with that description of Thomism, and I just see it as they imagine things and they think that their imagination corresponds to the fundamental nature of reality. They're making a distinction or a category error between the conceptual tier and the metaphysical tier. Like, our conceptions of reality do not correspond to the way reality fundamentally is. Just like when philosophers thought that time was a philosophical concept, then we learned that time was actually a physical concept that can bend. Our conceptions don't tell us anything about the fundamental nature of reality. And we know that happens over and over and over again in essentially every respect. It's like we hold an object, we think it's a solid object. Well, is this our conception giving us a insight into the fundamental nature of reality? Well, no, because it's not a solid object. It's 99% empty space. When we see colors, are the colors actually there? No, it's just a delusion presented by the brain. Like everything we see in reality, like 99% of everything we experience isn't a part of reality. It's just a made-up construction in our brains. So this idea that somehow our conceptions can give us access to the fundamental nature of reality is just a conflation between the conceptual tier and the metaphysical tier. So in my world,
so there's no way that the conceptual could be accurate or describe or correspond to the way the world actually is, or at least the fundamental nature of reality, no matter what.
It absolutely could, but you need the metaphysical evidence to demonstrate it does, as opposed to just being imaginary, because we know that the things we can imagine are just imaginary. They may or may not correspond to the fundamental nature of reality. So just like they may or may not correspond to empirical reality. Like, we can imagine when we see something rise by fire that it's caused by phlogiston, or we can imagine it's caused by the expansion of particles when they get heated. Both of those are equally imaginable, and one of them can correspond to reality and one of them doesn't. But you need that further empirical evidence to demonstrate which one does. So we have the ideas, and those are just ideas. They're nothing more. And then after we get the empirical evidence, then we can say, well, one is right, one is wrong. The same thing applies to conceptions about the fundamental nature of reality. They're just ideas until you can provide that metaphysical evidence to show which one of these ideas is correct, and which one is not correct, which you haven't done. The Thomists just assume that their conceptions are correct, and other philosophers just disagree. I mean, Thomism is not a widely accepted view in philosophy because of that reason. It's just that's their interpretation, and they think that their thoughts correspond to the fundamental nature of reality, and everyone else just has different thoughts, and they think their thoughts correspond to the fundamental nature of reality, or that there are none that correspond, or whatever. So the problem is that not that our ideas can't correspond to the fundamental nature of reality, but that you need to go more beyond just the fact that we have ideas, and you need to demonstrate that they do correspond to the fundamental nature of reality. And that Thomists have not done ever.
Okay.
Got just
would you say
one more issue, and then we'll go into the Q&A soon.
Yeah, I'll finish this. We can get right into it. So would you say that this epistemological procedure that takes place is that fundamental to nature, or is that like an essential aspect to the way reality is, or is this just a successful track record, or is this just one way that's been successful in how we understand reality? Is this empirical kind of?
No, it's just a conceptual framework. So epistemology are just conceptual frameworks. That's it. They don't tell us anything about the fundamental nature of reality.
Right. Now, did you discover this by some experiences that you've had, or something that's confirmed it in such a way, or is this just a successful model that has a really good track record and as to how we understand the world? Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, when you say, did I discover this based off experiences, and is this just a thing with a successful track record? Well, those are the same thing. Like if it has a successful track record, which has been discovered by experiences, I mean, those would technically be the same thing. But I mean, so again, the reason we can do this is by showing what fails. Like we know that our conceptions, when we try to apply them to reality, they fail. They don't work. So, but we know when we take our conceptions and apply them to reality and then get empirical evidence, well, then they do work. We can demonstrate that happens. And so then,
well, what I'm asking is that if this understanding of epistemology as you're describing it, if it has like an intuitive element to it, in other words, that we can just kind of reason about it and do it independently of any kind of comparable sense experience. In other words, is it something that you're describing that's essential about ourselves and reality, or is this just a track record independent of nature, so to speak, that helps us understand it better?
Well, no, it's not intuitive. It's something that we've learned through experiences. So
okay,
when we have an experience of, we imagine the thing was rising because of this new phlogiston particle, and then we discover through empirical evidence it doesn't, we can demonstrate that the conceptual things in our head do not correspond to the things in reality. Then when we try that, it fails. So we can differentiate as these are two different categories of things, because they don't work when we try to move from our head to reality. It just fails. And the same thing applies when we try to move to our head to the fundamental nature of reality. Like when we say time is a philosophical concept, therefore it can't bend, then we discover, oh wait, yes, it can bend. So our conceptions, our imagination of what the fundamental nature of reality is like, doesn't actually correspond to the fundamental nature of reality. And so we need some other way to show that whatever we're imagining actually does or doesn't. And so this is all stuff we've demonstrated through experience of reality, and why our conceptions fail in both of these categories, other categories.
Okay. Is it possible, and James, I'll finish here. Is it possible that there's maybe a deeper, or albeit different, epistemological procedure that we don't know about that can help us access fundamental, or like the fundamental nature of reality?
Absolutely. I mean, for sure, there definitely could be, and you just need to find some way to differentiate it between the imaginary and show that that methodology doesn't make the failures that our imagination does when we try to imagine what the fundamental nature of reality is.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay, well, I think that does it for me, at least on my end of the question.
You got it. Thanks very much, gentlemen. Always a pleasure. Let's see, Tom and his smart aleck comments about Pascal's wager. So let's get rocking and rolling. My dear,
me and James have a history on that topic. So
we do, yes. Tom, my dear friend. You know, Tom has been with us for over a year. Like, Tom has been since almost the start of the channel. Like, the second debate or something, like, Tom was like, hey, James, I love the way you dress. I want to dress like you. I want to look like you. And I was like, that's like weird and unrelated. Why would you say that? But he's like, anyway, can I come on and debate? And I was like, sure. So that's how we met. But I love the guy, you know? I got to be honest. Tom is a straight shooter. I love Steven as well. Don't get me wrong. Steven, you're terrific.
I'm wondering if Tom actually said those things.
That's totally, it's a true story. 100%.
Oh, is it really? Okay, rad. Yeah, man.
But
you wear some pretty nice blazers.
Yeah, I want those blazers and those crop top T-shirts and the mankinis he wears at the gym. They're so nice.
They're
Mankini.
Mankini.
You heard it here, folks.
Oh man, the Borat Mankini. So first up, Brian Stevens, thanks for your question. He said, given God is supernatural, is it possible the supernatural has qualities we are incapable of understanding, and thus our declaration of its qualities are unfounded?
Sure.
I think it might even be for, well, both of you are welcome to answer. So
Yeah, I figured both of us. Tom, if you want to go first.
Tom's just sure.
Yeah, I mean, if there are supernatural properties we can't understand or comprehend in that way, I mean, they're absolutely possible for sure. We definitely know there are natural things we can't comprehend in that way, but if they are uncomprehendable, then we can't use them as explanations for anything because we can't comprehend them.
Yeah. I would say it depends on the supernatural qualifications that one's making, because of course I wouldn't say that any of these kind of divine attributes, whatever they are, have a kind of incomprehensibility to them, but there are definitely supra rational, so to speak, such that even if we are talking about some aspect of God's existence, I think as a Thomist we have to do so by way of analogy, where we can look to instances in the world which understand something about God in the world in the same way, but it uses the word in a different kind of meaning. So we can talk about God in a general kind of way, but we have to kind of qualify it and be precise, depending on the context. So,
thanks so much. And our good friend, Philip, forgive me, Philip. I'm seriously sorry. Okay. Philip C. Is that right, Philip? Okay. Is that okay? Anyway, thanks for your question. He said, question for Stephen. Sorry if you already mentioned this, but do you claim to know for certain that God exists? If not, then why would God care if you doubt his existence if it is uncertain?
Right. So I don't think, it's kind of weird. It's like, philosophically, I'm not certain of God's existence, but as a Christian, I am. And there's an informed perspective as to why I think that. But I don't think it's a matter of certainty or uncertainty. I think that we can be philosophically confident and have a kind of philosophical approximation of coming to a knowledge of God's existence, but that knowledge is always going to be general. And what Aquinas rightly said is just confused, right? We're just kind of stuck in this realm of the God of the philosophers, or what Kierkegaard just called ethical religion. So I think that any move to God has to kind of have this element of devotion or intentional act on behalf of, the reality of God and our response to it, right? Because that matter of response is what is the bridging gap, so to speak. So, yeah, if that answers your question.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And Brian Stevens. Did I get to? No, I did read that one. That's embarrassing. Okay. Start declaration. Yeah, we got that one. Okay. Thanks as well. Travis Lee, very related. Travis Lee asks, question for Stephen, do you think that belief in God is a properly basic belief?
So I don't subscribe. I don't know. I don't subscribe to Reformed epistemology. I'm not. I like, that I'm very attracted to what's going on in the conversations of foundationalism. I describe God in other ways than to say God is properly basic. He might be. So if that helps your question at all.
You betcha. Thanks very much. And next up, do we have any for, we'll push any questions for Tom to the top of the list so he can get some action during the Q&A. Mind Onion, thanks for your question, though, for Stephen. They said, explain to me, like 5, how step by step we tell if an argument has intellectual vitality.
How do we, okay, so.
Explain to me like I am 5. Sorry about that.
Right. So it's kind of what I mentioned, Tom, towards the end of kind of our discussion, where really if we're trying to deal with the matter of God's existence, what we're not dealing with is kind of one subject among many, right? This is a subject which very much concerns the entire aspect of our lives. This has everything to do with how we understand suffering, not just in the world, but within ourselves, how we relate with one another, how we love one another, how we know one another. And I think our arguments or our conversations about God's existence need to reflect that existential vitality. So what I think, and I look to Kierkegaard on this kind of point, because he sees this kind of dead rationalism that's taking place in kind of, this historical evidential apologetics approach, whereby believers can kind of assure themselves on the reasonableness or the rationality of their belief, whereas they don't have that aspect of total commitment to the belief that they hold. So I'm just saying that we need to kind of have check marks when we're doing natural theology to kind of maintain that existential question, or this possibility for becoming spiritual should our philosophical investigations prove successful. That's kind of what I mean. Hopefully that helps. And hopefully if you're 5, you're not watching this.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next, Stripper Liquor. Yes. Thanks for your question. I hope that there are no 5-year-olds watching as well. Stripper Liquor, thanks for your question. They said, question for both. Does experiential evidence carry little or no weight if material evidence that comports cannot be found?
Trying to understand that question. Thomas,
it depends on the kind of claim. So personal evidence can be sufficient. Like if I told you I imagined I saw a unicorn, or I thought I saw a unicorn, or I am imagining a butterfly or whatever, those kinds of claims are perfectly reasonable to believe based off of just your own personal testimony. That's fine. But if you said there is a unicorn that exists in the world, well, that's going to need that external empirical evidence before it would be reasonable to believe. So it kind of depends on the level of the claim that you're making, whether or not the claim is reasonable. So like if I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable just based off of my testimony. You don't need the empirical evidence because it's implicit. We have tons of scientific evidence of dogs that are just not being mentioned in the statement, like their phylogeny, taxonomy, genetic makeup, chemical composition, how to train them, what they're allergic to, et cetera, et cetera. So just me saying I saw a dog, my testimony is sufficient because it's in addition to the empirical evidence that is also in that statement of what a dog is. But if I told you I saw a unicorn, then it wouldn't be sufficient because it doesn't also have that empirical basis. And you would need both before that kind of a claim would be reasonable to believe. So it depends on the kind of claim being made, whether or not that type of evidence is sufficient or not.
Gotcha. Thanks. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was pretty much going to say the same thing. I mean, it just depends on the kind of claim being made. So, I won't interject, but go ahead.
You betcha. False Scholar, thanks for your question. They said, can you ask TJump what was his technique for learning philosophy? And can you also ask when he's going to branch off into politics?
My strategy for learning philosophy was essentially just doing research and starting watching TED Talks and philosophy videos, and then just auditing classes at universities, because don't get a philosophy degree. It's a complete waste of money. Do not do it. If you want to take philosophy classes, just audit them. Just go to school, audit them. You can just pay for the one classes you want, and then you're done. Then I would like to definitely branch off into politics. James just needs to do more politics debates. Like, what is James's fault? I mean, blame James.
Actually, that's a great opportunity to ask people. If you can let us know in the comments or in the live chat what topics you would really enjoy, because we are kind of fishing around, seeing what topics people are most pleasured by. We definitely know the most popular seem to be science, flat earth debates, creation, evolution, intelligent design. Those are hot topics for sure. And we're kind of are there political ones that people would especially be pleasured to see? Philip, thanks for your super chat, Philip. He said, question for TJump. I'm not sure I agree when you said that there could be an epistemology that tells us whether something can be necessary. Could you elaborate on what you meant? Did that make sense?
So epistemology is just how we know things, like the study of knowledge. And could there be an epistemology that gets us knowledge of necessary things? Absolutely, there could be. I mean, I can't prove it false. So, I mean, I'm not going to reject it out of hand. I wouldn't say that it's completely impossible that we could ever know necessary things. I'm always going to grant the possibility that there's going to be an epistemology out there eventually that we're going to discover that could get us to those things. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it's going to look like, but it's definitely possible.
Gotcha. Thanks very much. And yes, do let us know. I'm like looking through the Spagilla 13 says more Wotan. Let's see. That's good to know. We can definitely invite Wotan back. We're setting up. There's a possibility of a tag team debate. That's a possibility. I'm trying to see if Nathan and Wotan are willing to work together. That could be a fun one. And let's see. No other topics? Come on, people. Okay, so let us know if there are political topics you'd be pleasured by. Maybe it's because I'm using the word pleasured. It's creeping them out. So thanks, everybody, for being here. I want to say special thanks to our dearest friends, TJump and Stephen Dunn. They are linked in the description. So if you're enjoying hearing what they've said, hey, conveniently, you can check out those links below. So, gentlemen, thanks one last time for being with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having us on, James. Appreciate it.
I really appreciate the opportunity again, James. Thank you. Of course.
My pleasure. Okay, now tell me who I am. Please clap.
Jeb.
That's right. Does everybody remember the low light video where Jeb at the end of his speech goes, please clap? Anyway, so very fun. I just love like political cringe stuff, no matter what side it's on. Whoa, kill a doggy. I missed a super chat. Let me find out. There's like someone, let's see. If I have, oh, Ronald, it's you. Okay, sorry, Ronald. I thought it was, we have Michael Dresden was just, but anyway, Ronald Madonka, thanks for your super chat. They said, Tom, will you believe in God if evidence is presented?
Sure.
Provocative. Thanks for letting me know about that, Kill a Doggy. Sorry I missed that. Very embarrassing. And just making sure, I thought there was one more message. Stripper Liquor said, what about a political topic with 3 to 4 guests? Was the impeachment case reasonable? That would definitely be interesting. We've seriously thought about having that. It's strangely, I think the thing is, it's my background is philosophy of religion. So when we started this channel, it was like almost all philosophy of religion. And then we kind of like, that's I think why. Oh, did I miss Sigifredo's super chat? I'm seriously sorry. I'm like failing tonight big time. But we basically, like, I've got a lot of friends from philosophy of religion, but I don't know a ton of political peeps. But as you can see, Destiny and Vosh will be going live in Los Angeles. That can be an exciting one. And let's see. Let me just check this out really quick. How embarrassing. Sigifredo, you're my boy. I'm sorry I missed this one. Give me 1 sec. Sig for short. But yes, we're excited. I'm going to read Sigifredo's super chat that I embarrassingly missed. And then we will wrap up. But yeah, if somebody, well, I should say this. If you want to debate politics, like if somebody wants to come on and debate politics, let me know. It's so hard to find conservatives. I think it's probably because most of our audience leans left because we've had like some, the only conservative we've had on that was like super popular was Sargon. And but then we've had like Vosh and Destiny and like Papa Bird Jake, like a lot of popular left-leaning people. So that's my guess. But whatever the reason is, especially if you're a conservative political debater, let us know. So sorry about this delay. Very embarrassing. Okay, we're almost there. Totally made up. There's no super chat from Sigifredo. That's funny. Okay, very tasteless joke. Did they say that they were joking me? Very funny. Okay, so anyway, thanks, folks. I hate saying goodbye. That's why I'm delaying. This is just too fun to be here.
I get it, man. Yeah, same.
Let me just check and see. Philip was named James. I got it wrong. Oh, okay, gotcha. It wasn't a tasteless joke. Thank you. Mason Calla. I got a smudge on my screen. Mason Callahan, thanks for your, I just want to make sure I got your name right. Thanks for your, they said, love the videos, by the way. Been enjoying all the discussions you've prompted. Thanks so much. All credit to the debaters. They are what make it fun. And so I just appreciate you guys hanging out with me. It's always fun to just be here for the parties that we have here. So it's always a great time. And with that, keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. And false scholar, I agree. We'll try to get Nick Fuentes. That would be a very fun one. Little Nicky. So keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. Take care, everybody.